We'll move along to Gonzalo Carrasco, our next and last speaker. Please hold on your questions to the end. Gonzalo is a research fellow at the Nanyang Technological University, working on peat-related rivers and coastal monitoring projects. Previously, he was at NUS 2019, also the Singapore MIT Alliance for Research and Technology, the MIT before NUS, and he studies the concentrations, sources, and bioavailability of trace metals in the regional marine environment, including mangroves, seagrasses, rivers, coastal seawater, open ocean water around Singapore, from the Malacca Straits to South China Sea. I think he's been to all over the world, and he has to come back to this region to focus on Singapore and the region. With that, Gonzalo, your presentation, please. Excellent.
So as I was saying, thanks everybody. This is such an exciting and multidisciplinary occasion. It's fantastic to hear about mines, rehabilitation, and monkeys doing things with peat and such a variety of things. It's really exciting to be here. And I will be telling you about the work I've been done in the region in terms of environmental impact of mangroves of Singapore. But first I will talk about some of the rehabilitation effort work done in Singapore here, not by me. I'm not a rehabilitation person. I'm an oceanographer, and I'll tell you about it in a little while. So this is work that I've done in Singapore and at NTU, before then in the US, and then SMART as well. I've done most of my work with Siu-Chin Chua, who is at NUS. And for this presentation, I'm talking about, I've had to discuss a lot of things with Shufeng from NParks, who guided me about a lot of the rehabilitation work. And of course, a lot of students doing all the work and, you know, clean places and mangroves, muddy rivers, all sorts of things. And basically trying to understand similar processes at different sizes. We're talking about trace metals from a regional scale to a local scale around Singapore to a zonal scale, particularly focusing on mangroves now for this presentation, and trying to understand the effect on organisms, whether they are cells in the sea or mangroves or us. So over the last 6-7 years in Singapore, I've been doing a lot of work. Mangroves was not what I studied for, but it's been quite exciting to get in the mud and work in mangroves and do some work in rivers and vegetables and seagrasses and whatnot. And of course, a lot of analytical work, which is my forte. And with that, I'll start to tell you a little bit about the mangroves in Singapore. Singapore is a small country, and mangroves are currently 1% of the area of Singapore. In the 1950s, they were 13% of the area. So there has been a significant decrease in the mangrove coverage, which is important. We need to, there has been a lot of rehabilitation efforts because of that. And it's important, particularly because in the region, there's a whole lot of biodiversity. More than half of the global species are present in the region. So we need to keep the mangroves alive. And with development of Singapore over the past 60 years since independence, a variety of activities that affect the mangroves differently have evolved, including shipyards, fish farms, urban growth, incinerators, industry, oil refinery, and you name it. A lot of things happen in Singapore, and particularly in discrete places, so we can actually identify places, as I will show you later. So I will be discussing some papers about the rehabilitation, discussing things done by the Dan's lab, the Mangrove lab at NUS, Peter Todd's at NUS as well, and Shufeng's efforts on mangrove reforestation, rehabilitation. And I'll be discussing these 4 papers specifically on rehabilitation in Singapore, urbanization effects, and management of rehabilitation efforts. So mangrove rehab efforts have been done in Singapore for a few years already, using different methods, for different reasons and with different results. And Dan's 2017 paper reviews some of them. And what I will do is I will show you some of the historical points of some of the rehabilitation efforts done. And this is all in line with the ASEAN Cooperation on Environment and part of the United Nations Decade on Ecosystem Restoration, which is about to start, as Tim pointed out. So I'll discuss 5 cases of Singapore. One of them is PASIR, one of the oldest. Reclamation happened for a park in the late 70s and basically caused the mangrove patch to become distant from the shoreline, as you know, it was now not shoreline anymore. The river was, Sungai Tampines, was extended to allow for some tidal inundation as plants were being planted in the newly reclaimed land here. And more recently, trenches were dug here. You can see in this image on the right, to actually allow for the water to go to the mangroves. And of course, the mangroves that were on the coast now are not on the coast anymore. So there was a significant change in the species. Mangroves changed from Abyssinia and Soneratia to Rhizophora and Bruguera. PULAU is another very interesting case, very typical of Singapore, where everything was engineered and managed by NEA. It's a landfill in the south of Singapore, and by the end of the change of the century, this massive central patch of mangroves and these two artificial rehabilitated patches of mangroves were basically around this circular landfill where the ashes from incinerators are buried in Singapore. Singapore is a small country, has no place to put its trash, so it burns it and then it buries it here, with the potential of a lot of metals leaching out of the system. So notice that there's also seagrasses here, corals, and a fish farm operation right out here that is used as a witness for potential leaks of metals coming out of the landfill. So it's a really interesting story. It's a really interesting experiment, if you ask me. Mangroves were replanted here in the two rehabilitated patches, too densely, so something went a little bit wrong, and lots of the Rhizophoras are what dominate this site. The third case that I want to discuss is PULAU TEKONG, which is another island north of Singapore in front of the Johor River, looking at Malaysia, Johor, and where a rehabilitation effort was done using experimental methodology tested by NParks. This was in the 2010s, and it was executed by a team including government, consultants, and engineers. Through trial and error, it used a wave dissipation device, because this is in a place with a lot of currents, and it brought rocks and sediments, so new substrate that was eroded away, and using biodegradable sacks and baskets, allow for the planting of some of these mangroves that were carefully zonated so that they would live where they can live. So some of the trees like Rhizophora and Abyssinia live closer to the sea, while farther inland would be Soneratia and Bruguera, for example. So a careful bathymetric study and a careful design was set up to resist the waves and the currents. And then, the zonation was carefully thought of, so to allow for the inundation, for enough inundation for the trees to live happily. The fourth case I want to discuss is a little bit like what Tim was talking about abandoned mines, but this is abandoned prawn farms in Pulau Ubin, another island north of Singapore, close to the mouth of the Johor River also. There were all of these prawn farms abandoned in the 60s or 50s, and basically there was this restoration set up with using a methodology that basically wanted to restore hydrological conditions. So there was careful elevation study, and with that a software was used to engineer and try to figure out if the trees what species of trees would be better to plant in each place. So before they were planted, they were actually thought of in terms of survivability predictions. Pulau Ubin is a star of Singapore. There's a lot of people included in the equation there, with this increased inclusivity of stakeholders for everything going from restoration, planning, design, and implementation. And the government is included, NGO, advocacy groups, academics, and the general public participates a lot in cleanups and in groups like Restore UBIN Mangroves and Friends of UBIN Network. Communication is key. There's been a lot of papers coming out from here, but there's also festivals, public walks, documentaries, and news coming from UBIN. In general, in Singapore, you know, there have been several of these concepts, and the lessons that have been learned is that we need to try what has been already tried. There's a lot of technical details about what type of trees and why not. We need to use regional and local relevant species for replanting and rehabilitation of mangroves. We need to think about long-term monitoring for sure, so that what we work on today doesn't, you know, get washed off next year. And we want to keep hydrology natural as possible, trying to consider river strength and coastlines. But this faces some challenge, as there are a lot of existing seawalls already around Singapore. As you can see in this diagram on the left, there are plans for the next 20, 30 years for massive coastal changes to fit more of the people that live in Singapore. And as well as all the rivers, most of which are already dammed for water preservation. So it's an interesting challenge here, where we want to replant the mangroves, but we, you know, at the same time, the city, being so small, needs to plan for the city itself. And ultimately, philosophical questions like, what do we want to do? Who do we want to benefit? And what services do we care for? Are being asked about these restoration efforts. We know, for example, that mangroves in Singapore provide the following ecosystem services. They are shoreline protection, fisheries, North Sea space, and some others in other places, not so much in Singapore. They're home for proboscis and humans in Banjarmasin, clearly. They have a recreation and cultural value in Singapore a lot. And as it was pointed out before, they store a lot of carbon, which is important for climate change. But now what I'm going to try to convince you in the second part of my presentation is that they, at the same time that they store carbon, they also store and control pollution long term. So to understand this, first we need to understand a little bit about the biogeochemistry of mangroves. The seawater brings sulfate that through bacterially mediated anaerobic respiration is turned into sulfide. That's why mangroves stink. And this sulfide precipitates metal pollution. So metals in the surrounding areas will precipitate and accumulate in the sediments of the mangroves. And this sets up questions about tolerance and uptake of metals, as the trees will actually be living in this surrounded by sulfide, metal sulfide. But the roots of the trees themselves are another interesting part that is dynamic and differential among species, because some of the roots of these plants actually bubble in oxygen in the already anoxic waters. And what this causes is the change of iron 2 into iron 3, causing co-precipitation of metals. So the metals that were not precipitated by the sulfide now will be precipitated by the iron. So we wonder if this differential oxygen bubbling capacity among Rhizophora and Avicennia species, for example, is a differential that will allow Avicennia to live better than Rhizophora to cope with metal stress and pollution. Metals are studied in general because in high concentration, they can be toxic, right? In low concentration, they have some functioning for enzymes and whatnot, but in high concentration, coming from a variety of different sources, they will be toxic, and they will by accumulating algae, shellfish, fish, and eventually us when we eat all of the above. And when they come inside us, they will accumulate in bones, liver, and dermis. If you were to take a bottle of cadmium, say, or zinc, and you go to the doctor and say, I drank a bottle of zinc, the doctor will give you as a solution a bottle of EDTA. It's a chelating agent that basically will trap chemically the metal into solution so they can stay into your digestive tract and you can excrete it. In nature, something similar happens, where chelation of metals is done by naturally existing chelating agents, which we call ligands only because we don't have any other idea about them. What happens is that the total dissolved metal is broken down into the organic phase, which is what is the largest portion of the total dissolved metal, and the smaller portions of the inorganic and the free, which are the bioavailable forms of the metal. So the presence of this ligand controls actively the bioavailability and the effect of metals in natural waters. This used to be thought of as, this ligand coming in the vacuum, sort of in the ocean. Don't forget, I'm an oceanographer, right? That, is produced by phytoplankton and bacteria and whatnot. But, more and more coastal studies have been focusing on sources of metals and organic matter coming from industry being brought by rivers, chemic matter being brought by rivers, and mangroves being right in the center between coastal areas and open ocean being questioned as if, are they sources of these ligands that control the bioavailability of metals? Are they simply an interface? Are they a place where metals can be stored? And to be able to understand this, we need to do a study of a river to seawater and mangroves being in the center, where across the salinity gradient, we can actually understand the concentrations of some components going from river to seawater. And we can understand if mangroves are actually a source adding ligands or metals, or a sink of adding ligands or metals, knowing pretty well that in this intermediate salinity region is a place where across the salinity gradient dissolved organic matter will precipitate out. So we've set up to do this work from a marine perspective and then focusing on mangroves. In the coastal areas around the region, we've done this work and finding the ligands. This is the concentration of ligands for zinc in the Malacca Straits and South China Sea, and somewhere near these large rivers in Borneo, in the Malaysian side of Sarawak. And we found really high concentrations of these ligands in some of these, close to these rivers. Some of these rivers are affected by peat. So these would be obviously affected by agricultural erosion, peat drying and whatnot. So these, the ligands that come down from these rivers will accumulate in the mangroves that are in the coastal areas. And in Singapore, what we've done is trying to zoom in the equation a little bit more, is we've studied 5 sites where we actually look at the activities that are nearby each one of the sites. So we've looked at Pandan, which is in the south of Singapore, where there's a shipyard and a commercial pier. Sungai Buloh, where there's agriculture and aquaculture nearby, and it's close to one park run by NParks. Mandai, which is right next to a really busy road, the road that connects Singapore with Malaysia, and a lot of industries. And Kati Bongsu, which is a place that is relatively pristine, it's still residential mostly, and there's some industries nearby. And PASIR, which is this park that had this coast grown by land reclamation, right? And what we set up to do was basically we studied the sediment and the water and metals and ligand concentrations and a lot of different parameters in areas near Abyssinia, control, Rhizophora, and in some upstream water, midstream water, and downstream water at low tide when we can actually see a stream coming down from the mangroves. We used a couple of different methodologies to try to look at different time variable integrations of the results, and basically trying to see which one would be easier or not to use as well. And the results we got are these. We can see that these are concentrations of zinc. I mean, and I could be talking about other metals, but I'll be talking about zinc and zinc ligands, whereby concentrations of zinc in the sediments are high in Pandan and in Mandai, and they are not so high in Kati Bongsu and Sungai Buloh. You go to the roots of these same trees, and likewise, Mandai and Pandan are high, and Kati Bongsu and Sungai Buloh are a little bit lower. Notice that the dark blue, which is Abyssinia, has a higher concentration in the sediments and apparently higher concentration in the roots as well, except Sungai Buloh. If you look at the bioconcentration factors, which is the concentration of roots divided by sediments, we can see that the places where there were a lot of sediments, which are marked by these dots, Pandan and Mandai, the bioconcentration factor is lower, as if the system was sort of closing the gates on taking any more metals into the mangrove system. While in the places where the concentrations were low, Sungai Buloh and Kati Bongsu, the bioconcentration factor was higher. The plant had no need to reduce uptake. And interestingly, in most of these cases, Abyssinia has a lower bioconcentration factor, which could relate to its highest bubbling capacity. So this leaves us asking questions about metal uptake regulation, or if this is somewhat ligand or sulfide mediated. If we look at the water, it gets a little bit more confusing because we get in the surface water, upstream, midstream, and downstream, we get all possible combinations of upstream being a source of ligand, downstream being a sourse of ligand, midstream being a source of ligand, or in the case of Pandan, which is a place near shipyards, a high concentration of metals. This negative concentration of ligands translates into really high concentrations of metals, and in excess of the ligands. If we look at the pore water, these high concentrations of metals turns into a huge concentration of ligands, close to 1,000 nanomolar. Looked at my values before in rivers were in the order of 5 to 15. So this concentration of ligands here is gigantic. And if we exclude this anomalous point of Pandan, say, and we look at all the other places, in general, there is higher concentration of ligands coming from Rhizophora and Abyssinia pore water than there is coming from the blanks. I mean, implying that some of these roots could be actually producing, or the microbes around could be producing some of these ligands using the sulfide, which is one of the pieces of the ligand. So if we were to plot all of these data together, here is my river data, some seawater data that I have from coastal Singapore, average points at high salinity and low salinity in the river. The mangrove surface water, the upstream, midstream, and downstream, seems to have the same trend. It seems to be a source of ligands that is much higher than the river or the sea. But with this similar trend, as I told you, going down with increasing salinity. If we add pore water with these massive numbers of 1,000 nanomolar ligand, it's pretty clear that the pore waters are pointing in the same direction as well, if we plot them against salinity. And it could be that some of these anoxic conditioned ligands living in the middle of the mud actually degrade, or there are some processes before these go into surface water, before these go into the transit between river water and seawater. But in general, we can see that these could have the potential to be a massive source of ligands, which would control the metal pollution and keep it non-bioavailable. So this, I say, is a massive ecosystem service that mangroves need to be given credit for. So in conclusion, mangroves in Singapore provide ecosystem services that make them important to restore and rehabilitate. Rehabilitation efforts in Singapore include different combinations of stakeholders and good degree of success after a learning curve. Ecosystem services include carbon storage, but I also say that pollution storage should be given importance. And compared with regional waters, riverine sources control bioavailability of metal pollution in coastal waters with the production of this presence of this zinc ligand. Zinc and its zinc ligands were studied in local mangroves, and mangroves can be a very large source of ligands and a large storage of metals, given that they are healthy, of course, because if there is no trees, if there is no microbes of the whole ecosystem of the mangrove surroundings, there will be none of these services provided. And then the pollution will be just free to go out into the fish farms and the beaches. This highlights the interconnectivity of environmental problems and ecological restoration initiatives at regional and global levels. And that's all I wanted to present. Thank you very much.